In this video, I'm continuing our interview with Brett Guarino, VCDX number 256. He's discussing the terms and concepts that every VCDX candidate needs to know.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and clicking the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
Okay, let's start talking about the core concepts that a VCDX needs to master. As you can see on the slide here, we've got a slide that's titled Types of Designs, and it says that they're conceptual design, logical designs, physical designs, and everyone usually looks at that and thinks not a whole lot about it, and they just sort of move on. But Brett, why don't you tell people what these three terms mean and why they matter to the VCDX design candidate?
Yeah, so everything is going to begin with conceptual, and the conceptual model, we'll look at the components that make it up later, but conceptually, you're not really doing much of anything with the exception of considering the customer's business drivers. And you're looking at the customer's business drivers as the source of all information that's going to feed into how you're going to actually build and architect the design. You're not necessarily going to make any decisions in the conceptual model beyond my customer needs X, right? You're not making decisions on how you're going to deliver on that, but you're going to establish what the customer's requirements are, any constraints on the design, any risks, any assumptions, etc. And then based on that conceptual model, once it's developed, you'll then proceed to the logical model. In the logical model, you start to actually make some decisions that can address the customer's needs, which were established in a conceptual model, with acknowledgement for the risk potential for the decisions you're making and whether or not the customer is willing to accept the risk. And it's really more about justification of each design decision that you make. And we'll get into the justification model that we use when making a design decision within the logical consideration. And the physical takes us into the actual implementation. That's something that, as an architect, I may not actually even be involved in, but it would be things including very low-level details such as cabling diagrams, what controller is going to see which disks and how those disks should be used in a particular vSAN implementation. For example, a disk on controller 0 is going to be used for cache and a particular disk group, whereas a disk on controller 1 would be used for capacity within a particular disk group. We want to have that all laid out, all diagrammed, and consistently labeled for each host, each cluster. And we might even have some virtual machine details inside of there, even some operating system level details inside of there. It's going to cover the implementation processes and procedures and the standard operating procedure documentation. So you can see how these build upon one another.
All right, I've got a couple of questions for you here. You started off this discussion by talking about business requirements. What did business requirements have to do with VCDX? I thought VCDX was just very technical, low-level descriptions of what the customer's architecture looks like. What's this whole business about business requirements?
Yeah,
why should we care?
It's a very common misconception, which you mentioned. And I say it's a misconception, but it's a fair misconception in that in order to achieve the VCDX, you've got to navigate this path where you go down the track of getting your VCP, which is largely technical in nature. And then you take steps towards getting your VCIX by achieving the design and the deploy of VCAPs, which get successively more technical in nature. And then you get to the VCDX, where drafting your documentation is going to require that you ultimately provide a physical model, which takes up most of the pages of documentation you're going to submit. So it's largely a very technical, very physical process. But everything that you do in that process to get to that point is driven by the business. Technology for the sake of technology is fun. It's great if you're a nerd and you're into nerd knobs like me, and you just love the idea of new technology and working with it and just working with tech just because you enjoy it. But that's not why a business wants to adopt it. A business wants to adopt it for business reasons. It's going to lower costs. It's going to drive value. It's going to decrease time to market. These are the kinds of factors that we need to consider when we're going to talk to customers about how our technologies can change and transform their business. Because if we're failing to do that, why would they want to invest with us? We've got competitors in the market who have compelling arguments around that. So regardless of who I'm representing, I want to make sure that I'm generating and translating the business value of that. And customers, when we go talk to them, they're usually, depending on which customer or key stakeholder you're talking to, they're going to talk at some point in those types of terms. And as an architect, you really need to have the ability to communicate to the low-level technical people as well as the high-level business people who don't know anything about the low-level tech, but they can tell you what they're looking to achieve with technology. And you should know which solutions you have in your portfolio that can address those demands.
So what's going to happen to a VCDX candidate if they do their VCDX defense and they don't know the business requirements, or they didn't actually scope out what those requirements were? What's going to happen to that candidate?
Well, hopefully they didn't get in the room if they didn't do that properly, because in the actual document review process, hopefully that would be caught, and there would be a glaring hole where the conceptual model should have been in their design. Which these things happen, right? There's a whole submission process where the design can get kicked back to the candidate because it fails to check off the boxes and doesn't come in with a high enough score for it to actually be entertained in the room. And there would be feedback associated with that if that were the case. But yeah, I mean, I can admit, I'm guilty in my first iteration of my design of having way too much physical, because I already had the design and it was implemented and I had the reality of it and I knew the physical inside and out because I did the installation myself and the implementation and subsequent management and the handoff and everything. So I was very physical. Walking in the room though, I had enough conceptual to get in the room, and I failed to speak to conceptual when I got in the room for the actual defense. So it was there, it was inadequate, and I failed to speak to it in my defense. And my failure absolutely speaks to what happens when you don't speak to the conceptual model and the logical model adequately. The design itself, again, extremely physical to get you in the room, but once you're in the room, you've got to be able to identify why you're doing things. And if you go with technical reasoning, you're not actually addressing why the design was created. And it was always created for the customer, not because you've got cool technology.
So if you are a VCDX candidate, you go through the VCX defense and they kick you out because you haven't done the conceptual and logical, or as you said, if you were in the submission process and they kicked it back because you don't have the conceptual or logical, you don't have those business requirements, would it be a good strategy for that candidate to just throw a hissy fit and start throwing more technical stuff their way?
Were you in my first defense? Because I feel like that's what I yeah, it's one of those things where when you're wrong and you don't know you're wrong, you'll double down on what's wrong if you think right. So I absolutely did exactly that. And not necessarily throwing a hissy fit part, but I doubled down on the physical. And, while I was able to flex and show off some, I know about this little advanced parameter inside of an ESXi host, and if you tweak it, it does this. Ultimately, that's not what this whole journey is about. This journey is about taking the customer's business requirements, being able to actually interview the customer and identify those requirements, and identify those drivers, and then establish the requirements based on the business drivers. Like, why is the customer considering introducing this technology to their environment? Okay, that's a big, big consideration. And knowing also how to interview a customer to extrapolate those details to actually create a conceptual model, because that's the second part of the defense. So you have the submission itself, where you need to be able to speak to the conceptual and the logical and justify all of the decisions that you made in the logical model based on the conceptual model, based on the customer's business drivers. And you also have to be able to kind of work backwards from that and prove that you can work with a customer in a very short period of time to establish a rough conceptual model and make some good, solid, sound, logical decisions that expose your methodology and reveal that your methodology is in fact one that is going to always be based on what the customer needs, and you will be able to justify your decisions by going back to what the customer said they wanted.
All right, next question. So one thing I've seen with lots of people in our design courses, and even people who go on to become VCDX candidates, is they don't necessarily have a clear understanding or clear delineation between conceptual design versus logical design versus physical design. What helped you to understand the differences? Are there resources that that candidates could turn to?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the most frustrating piece of advice that I ever received as a candidate. And you may be wondering why I would give that same advice to anyone else who is currently a candidate. It's because as a candidate, I failed to fully understand and grasp what was the value of this particular document. But the document is the actual blueprint for the VCDX. A lot of thought and consideration and care goes into that particular document, and I personally used it to formulate effectively formulate my table of contents. I started my design with a table of contents. My partner and I did. My partner for my design was Rebecca Fitzhugh. And we drafted our table of contents largely based on the blueprint, which is probably not a bad use of it, but I failed to really grasp the conceptual, logical, and physical statements within that blueprint. It wasn't until I was after my second defense, really going into my second defense and revisiting that document, where I started to kind of make sense of it and start to have very clear understanding of the differences in the lines between conceptual, logical, and physical. And conceptual very clearly defines in that document that it's composed of your requirements based on your business drivers, your constraints, which are imposed upon your design by the customer, your risks and your assumptions and your risk mitigation strategy. And the risks that are introduced as a result of your assumptions, right? This is all pretty clearly stated inside of the actual blueprint for the VCDX. So I would definitely say you want to look at that, because it not only separates or gives the lines of separation between these, but also gives you a little bit of meat within each one and tells you kind of what you're looking for. For example, in the logical model, it spells out that you're going to be looking at design qualities such as recoverability, availability, manageability, performance, and security. And in the physical level, you're looking at unique diagrams that are going to be very, very in-depth and say how each node should be configured, very low-level configs. What advanced parameters should I be modifying on the host and why? Can I justify that decision, right?
Got it. So one more question, then we'll wrap this particular video up in the interview series. So the next question I had, it actually comes from a discussion I was having with some other colleagues recently. The term physical design seems like a somewhat outdated, at least to one of the people I was talking to, it seems like a somewhat outdated way of referring to it. He was choosing instead to refer to what here we call the physical design. He was calling the detailed design. And I think he definitely had a point. The physical design is the most detailed of all. But what would your recommendation be for VCDX candidates? Should they go in and start renaming terms like physical design becomes detailed design, or what should a candidate do?
I don't know that that's necessarily something that would even remotely be of consequence in the actual VCDX journey. It's one of those things that I think as a VCDX, when you're weighing all of the variables in this process, you can easily get bogged down in details such as that and wonder how much weight or gravity something like that has. And frankly, in my opinion, it has no weight and no gravity, and it serves as a massive distractor from the whole point of this, right? The point of this is get your conceptual, your logical, and your physical, and make sure that you have a sound justification for the design decisions that you intend to make. Because the customer said so is not a good answer. Because it's cool tech is not a good answer. Because the latency was too high might be a good answer. But again, you want to always take things back from the technical all the way back to what the customer said in justifying the technical. If I can say that my customer actually is responsible for having said something and demonstrated a need for me to worry about this particular metric in the physical layer, then I'm really at that point traversing conceptual, logical, and physical with one very simple statement. And the power to do that and justify those detailed or physical decisions, whatever you want to call them, that's really the power of this process. Much, much more so than getting tied up in the nuance of how things are named or nomenclatures, etc. What may be misleading to one person is not misleading to another, and saying things like physical or detailed. But ultimately, when you have conversations with people, someone might call a vMotion a live migration. As long as we both know that we're speaking the same language when we use those terms, I frankly tend to try to avoid getting bogged down in such considerations.
All right.
All right.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this video in this
interview
interview series.
I'd
like to thank you, Brett, for your straightforward discussion about not just the fact that you are a VCDX, but that it was a process to get there. And you sharing the lessons that you learned along the way, I think, will come in quite handy. And again, a quick reminder here, another thing that's going to come in very handy for VCDX candidates is that VCDX blueprint. I'll drop a link to that blueprint down in the YouTube comments below. Make certain you check that out and check us out in the next video.
Remember to subscribe and join me in the next video where we continue our interview with Brett Guarino.